had been camping for years, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling even before I left. Maybe it was the fact that I was going alone this time. Usually I had a friend or my brother with me, but this time I wanted the solitude. I told myself I needed a break from everything: work, people, noise. I wanted the quiet. I picked a place that wasn't too far from home, but still deep enough in the wilderness to feel isolated. It was a remote part of Pennsylvania, not too well known, but still open for camping. It was late September, just as the leaves were beginning to turn. The air cool enough at night that I would need a fire, but not so cold that I would be miserable. The drive took about 4 hours. The last hour was on an old dirt road, barely maintained, the kind that makes you think twice about driving on it alone. But I had been on worse roads before. The trees grew thicker as I drove, branches hanging low, scraping the roof of my truck now and then. The deeper I got, the more the outside world seemed to disappear. No cars, no houses, no signs of people at all. I found the spot I had marked on the map weeks ago, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. It was perfect. No signs of other campers, no old fire pits, no trash, just untouched land. I parked the truck, got out, and stretched. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and pine. It was quiet, but not in a way that was unnatural. I could still hear the wind moving through the trees, the occasional chirp of a bird, the rustling of something small in the brush. I set up my tent about 20 yards from the creek, made sure my truck was locked, and gathered some firewood before it got dark. It felt good to be out there alone. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the first few hours just taking it all in, walking around, making sure I was familiar with my surroundings. The last thing I wanted was to get turned around if I had to step away from camp at night. As the sun started to set, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. The food tasted better out here, maybe because I had worked up an appetite, or maybe because eating next to a fire under an open sky just made everything better. I sat there for hours, staring at the flames, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. There was no cell service, no distractions, just me, the fire, and the woods. It wasn't until I was getting ready to turn in for the night that I noticed something off. The quiet had changed. It wasn't the usual night silence where the insects go still for a moment and then start up again. This was different. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood there, firewood still in my hands, listening. No wind, no movement, nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that my brain was playing tricks on me now that I was completely alone. I threw the last of the wood on the fire, making it burn brighter, then went into the tent. I left the fire going. I always did on the first night when camping alone. It gave me a sense of security, even if I knew it wouldn't stop anything from coming close if it really wanted to. I laid in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon roof of my tent, listening. The silence stretched on. I started to drift off, but then I heard it. A single footstep, not an animal. It was heavy, deliberate, close. My heart started pounding. I listened, holding my breath. Another step, and another. It was just outside my tent. I slowly reached for the knife I always kept next to me when I camped. My fingers wrapped around the handle, gripping it tight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, every muscle in my body tensed, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest sounds returned. The night noises came back. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves. It was as if whatever had been there was gone now, and the forest was letting me know it was safe again. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, knife in hand, listening for any sound that didn't belong. But there was nothing else. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no broken branches, No sign that anyone or anything had been near my campsite. But I knew what I heard. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had come all this way. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe a deer stepping cautiously, its weight heavier than I expected. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me in the stillness of the night. I spent the day exploring, fishing in the creek, trying to shake off the unease. By the time night fell, I almost convinced myself it had been nothing. But then it happened again. Just after midnight, I heard it. The same slow, heavy steps. Only this time, it didn't stop outside my tent. It circled me. The sound moved from one side of the tent to the other, slow and steady. I gripped my knife, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight outside. But something told me I didn't want to see what was there. Then, just like before, it stopped. And the silence came again. I stayed awake until dawn. The moment the first light broke through the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. I expected to see footprints, disturbed dirt, something to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But there was nothing. I made up my mind right then. I was leaving. I packed up faster than I ever had before, shoving everything into my truck without caring if it was organized. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to be gone. As I climbed into the truck and turned the key, I happened to glance at the tree line, and I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees, standing just far enough away that I couldn't make out its face. But I knew it had been watching me. I threw the truck into gear and didn't look back. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on paved roads, that I finally let myself breathe. I still don't know what I heard or what I saw that morning. I don't know if it was a person, some hermit living deep in the woods, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing: I'll never go camping alone again. I had never been much of a camper, but life had been weighing on me lately. I was working too many hours, barely sleeping, and felt like I was running on fumes. It was 2019, and I lived alone in a small apartment in Minnesota. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and I needed to breathe. I needed space, so I decided to take a solo camping trip for the first time in my life. I wasn't a complete stranger to the outdoors. My dad used to take me on hunting trips when I was a teenager, but I never truly enjoyed them. He always tried to toughen me up, pushing me harder than necessary. I learned how to shoot, gut a deer, and start a fire, but I never found joy in it. Now, as an adult, I figured I could at least use those skills for something peaceful, just me, a tent, and the woods. I picked a remote spot in northern Minnesota, not too far from the Canadian border. It was late September, and the weather was perfect, cool enough that the bugs wouldn't be a problem, but not so cold that I'd freeze at night. I found a national forest where dispersed camping was allowed, meaning there were no designated campsites, no people, and no amenities. Just deep woods, miles from the nearest road. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, a propane stove, a hunting knife, and enough food to last 4 days. I brought a rifle too. I wasn't planning on hunting, but I felt better having it with me. You never know what's out there. I left early in the morning, driving for hours until I reached the gravel road that led into the forest. The last half hour of the drive was rough, potholes, washed out sections, and tree branches scraping the sides of my truck. When I finally found a spot that looked good, I pulled over and parked. There was no one around, no other cars, no signs of people, just quiet. I grabbed my backpack and started hiking. The plan was to walk a few miles in, far enough that I wouldn't hear the road, and set up camp near a small lake I had found on the map. The hike was peaceful, the air crisp with the smell of pine and damp earth. Every now and then, I'd hear rustling in the bushes, squirrels, maybe a deer, but nothing alarming. Took me about an hour to find the lake. It was small, almost like a pond, surrounded by thick trees. The water was dark and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I found a flat spot near the shore and started setting up my tent. By the time I was done, the sun was getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I built a small fire, cooked some canned soup on my stove, and sat back, enjoying the solitude. The only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish in the water and the distant call of an owl. It was perfect, but that first night I didn't sleep well. I woke up sometime after midnight, feeling uneasy. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the woods were completely silent. Too silent. I lay there listening. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps, coming from the trees behind my tent. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a deer, but something felt off. The footsteps weren't random. They were slow, deliberate. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tight. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the tent. I got up, stiff and exhausted. The forest felt normal again. Birds chirping, a light breeze rustling the leaves. I looked around my campsite, but nothing seemed disturbed. No tracks, no signs of anything. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had dreamed the footsteps. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I pushed the thoughts away and went about my day. I spent the morning fishing at the lake, catching a few small trout, which I cooked over the fire for lunch. I hiked around, explored the area, and enjoyed the fresh air. By the time evening came, I felt more at ease. The night before had just been nerves. That was all. But when the sun went down, the feeling came back. That creeping unease, like I wasn't alone. I tried to ignore it, but as I sat by the fire, eating another can of soup, I kept glancing into the trees. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something in my peripheral vision, a shadow shifting between the trunks. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then, just as I was getting ready to put out the fire and head into the tent, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, coming from the same direction as the night before. I froze, my entire body on edge. The fire was still burning, casting flickering light around my campsite. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, my eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting, but I didn't hear anything else. No movement, no sound. Finally, I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was just an animal. I was in the middle of the woods, after all. Things move at night. Couldn't let my mind spiral. I put out the fire and climbed into my tent, keeping my rifle close. I barely slept. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints, human footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trees to the edge of my campsite. But here's the thing, they weren't mine. I hadn't walked in that area. I had been sticking to the same spots, the fire, the tent, the lake. Whoever had made those prints had been standing there, watching. I packed up my stuff as fast as I could. I wasn't staying another night. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The idea that someone had been creeping around my camp while I slept made my skin crawl. I hiked back to my truck in record time, my rifle in my hands the entire way. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to see movement in the trees, but nothing happened. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and drove out of there without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never went camping alone again. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the forests of eastern France. The air had cooled, the summer crowds had thinned, and the idea of quiet isolation in nature felt like the reset I needed. I had camped many times before, often in more remote areas, and I had never been the type to worry too much about the dangers of being alone in the woods. I was always careful, always prepared. I had all the right gear, the right experience, and I knew how to handle myself. I had planned to spend 4 nights deep in the forest, far from any town or campsite. I wanted complete solitude, the kind that forces you to listen to the sounds of the wild, to your own thoughts. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent beside a small clearing, cooked a simple meal over my camping stove, and fell asleep to the distant sound of owls calling through the trees. The second day, I hiked deeper into the forest, following an old, unmarked trail that I had studied on a satellite map before my trip. It wasn't an official route, but it looked like it had been used before, probably by hunters or other solo campers like me. By the time I made camp on the second night, the weather had started to shift. The sky had darkened with thick clouds, the wind had picked up, and the air smelled like rain. I found a decent spot on a slightly elevated patch of ground, knowing that if it rained, I didn't want to be in a low-lying area where water might pool. I set up my tent quickly and gathered enough firewood to last the night, even though I knew I might not be able to keep a fire going in wet conditions. The rain started just after sunset. It wasn't heavy at first, just a soft patter against the leaves, the occasional gust of wind sending a shiver through the trees. I sat inside my tent, listening to it, feeling a kind of peaceful detachment from the world. The rain picked up an hour later, and soon it was a steady, drumming downpour. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. I checked the forecast before I left, and while it had mentioned possible rain, I hadn't expected it to be this heavy. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain when I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A rustling close by, too close. At first, I thought it was just the wind shaking the trees, but then I realized it was moving. Slow, deliberate steps through the wet undergrowth. My first instinct was to assume it was an animal, maybe a deer or a boar, but something about it felt off. The steps weren't erratic like an animal's. They were steady, almost cautious. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just held it, listening. The footsteps stopped. Then nothing but the rain. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, straining my ears, barely moving. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But even as I convinced myself of that, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Sometime after midnight, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of something scraping against my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. It was soft at first, like the edge of a branch brushing against the fabric. But then it came again, deliberate, slow. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay awake, listening to the rain, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. When dawn finally came, the storm had passed. The forest was drenched, the ground muddy, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. I unzipped my tent cautiously, stepping outside into the gray morning light. That's when I saw them. Footprints, human footprints. They circled my tent, slow and meandering, but unmistakably human. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. These weren't my footprints. The rain had washed away most of my own tracks from the night before, but these were fresh, pressed deep into the wet earth. Someone had been here, standing just outside my tent. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag, stuffed my gear into my pack. I didn't think. I just moved. I needed to get out of there. I followed the trail back the way I had come, my eyes scanning the trees, my ears tuned to every sound. I kept expecting to see someone watching me from the undergrowth, but I didn't. I didn't stop walking until I was out of the deep woods, until I reached the small parking area where I had left my car. I drove away without looking back. I don't know who was out there that night, circling my tent in the dark, but I know this. I was not alone in those woods, and whoever it was, they never made a sound. I never used to believe in things like this. I always thought people who claimed to see things in the woods were either paranoid or lying. I've hunted, fished, and camped alone for years, and I never saw anything stranger than an occasional bear. I felt comfortable in the wild, but this night changed everything. It was early October, the air crisp but not freezing. I had planned a solo camping trip in the mountains of Colorado, near the Wyoming border. I had been up there a few times before, mostly during deer season, but this trip was just to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I wanted a few days away from my phone, away from people, just me and the forest. I drove out in the early morning, stopping in a small town to top off my gas tank and grab some extra supplies. The town was small, just a gas station, a diner, and a few scattered houses. The kind of place where people knew each other, where strangers stood out. The guy at the gas station eyed my truck as I filled up, giving me a nod before disappearing inside. I didn't think much of it. I made it to the trailhead by noon, parked my truck in a little pull-off and double-checked my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, rifle. I always carried my rifle when I camped alone. Not because I was worried about people, but because of bears and mountain lions. Out here, you had to be careful. The hike in was about 5 miles. The trail was overgrown in spots, but the deeper I went, the more peaceful it felt. The sounds of the highway faded until all I could hear was the wind moving through the trees, the occasional call of a bird, the rustling of small animals in the brush. By late afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a creek with a fallen tree I could use as a bench. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and by the time the sun started setting, I had a small fire going. As the last light faded behind the trees, I sat by the fire, eating a can of chili and watching the flames. I felt at peace. Out here, I didn't have to think about anything. The only things that mattered were the basics: food, warmth, staying aware of my surroundings. But then, as I was finishing my food, something felt off. At first, I couldn't place it. The woods were quiet, which wasn't unusual at night, but this was different. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, no night birds, just silence. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that when the forest goes quiet like that, something is nearby. I set my empty can down and slowly reached for my rifle, resting it across my lap. My fire crackled, the only sound in the darkness. Then I heard something move. It was faint, but I could tell it was big. It wasn't the quick rustling of a rabbit or the light steps of a deer. It was something heavier, moving slowly through the trees. I scanned the tree line, my eyes adjusting to the dark. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That deep, instinctive feeling that I was being watched. I waited, rifle in hand, for what felt like an hour. The sounds didn't come back, but the feeling never left. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Probably a bear passing through, maybe a deer. I threw another log on the fire and forced myself to relax. By midnight, I was exhausted. The fire had died down to embers, and the cold was creeping in. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, my rifle beside me in the tent, and tried to sleep. It was a mistake. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I just felt off. My body was tense, my heart pounding. Then I heard it. Something was outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not an animal, not the random shifting of branches in the wind. Something was walking around my campsite. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The steps were soft, careful, like they were trying not to be heard. Then they stopped, right next to my tent. My breath caught in my throat. My rifle was within reach, but I didn't move. I just lay there, listening, my body frozen. Then the worst part, it breathed. A slow, heavy breath, inches from the thin fabric of my tent. I gripped my rifle and forced myself to move. In one motion, I yanked the zipper down, aimed my rifle, and pointed my flashlight outside. Nothing. The fire was still glowing faintly, casting weak light across the clearing. The forest beyond was just darkness. But I knew something had been there. I stepped out, sweeping my flashlight across the trees. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I didn't. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the wind had played tricks on me, but the feeling never left. I stoked the fire back to life, sat with my rifle across my lap, and waited for dawn. By morning, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But then I found the tracks, deep, human-like footprints circling my tent. But they weren't quite human. Too long, too narrow, and they didn't have toes. I packed up and left. I never went back. I don't know what I saw, or what I almost saw, but I know one thing for sure. Something was out there that night, and it wasn't human. It was supposed to be a quiet trip. Just me, the woods, and the kind of silence you only find miles from the nearest road. I had planned it for weeks, mapping out a route that took me deep into a state forest, away from crowds and designated campgrounds. It wasn't my first solo camping trip, but it would be my longest. 5 days alone, relying only on what I carried on my back and what the land provided. I parked my truck on the shoulder of an old dirt road, checked my gear, and started hiking. The trail wasn't well maintained, which is exactly what I wanted. I didn't want to see anyone else. I didn't want to hear anyone else. Just nature, just solitude. The first few hours were peaceful, birds calling, the crunch of leaves under my boots, the occasional rustle of something moving through the brush. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near a small creek and set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered wood, and got a small fire going. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. Felt good. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't fear, just the usual adjustment to being out in the wild. The sounds were different from home, sharper, less predictable. The distant hoot of an owl, the scurrying of small animals, the wind shifting through the trees. Normal things, but they kept me awake. The second day, I hiked deeper into the forest. The trail faded until it was nothing but a faint impression on the earth. I marked my path with bits of cloth tied to branches, just in case. I spent the afternoon fishing in the creek, catching enough for dinner. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted, until I found the boot print. It was fresh, too fresh. The edges hadn't softened. No leaves had blown into it. Someone else had been here, maybe an hour or two ahead of me. The print was large, wider than my own. I crouched, studying it. Deep impressions meant whoever made it was carrying a heavy pack. But this wasn't a marked trail, and I hadn't seen a single sign of another person since I left my truck. I felt something then, a shift in the air. Not a sound, not a movement, just an instinct, that deep, primal part of the brain that tells you something isn't right. I stood slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just empty woods stretching in every direction. Still, I packed up my things and walked back to my camp with a little more urgency than before. That night, I kept my fire small. I ate quickly, my back to the tent, watching the darkness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I knew the print didn't mean danger. Plenty of people hike in the woods. but something felt off. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, careful, deliberate. I lay still in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The steps were close, circling my camp, stopping, starting again. I reached for the knife strapped to my belt. My fingers wrapped around the handle, but I didn't move. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but I knew better. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I waited, heart pounding. Minutes passed. Silence. Then a long, slow drag of breath. Someone was standing inches from the thin fabric of my tent. Breathing. Not an animal. Person. I held my breath, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The seconds stretched endless. And then, just as quietly as they had come, the steps retreated. Slow, measured, fading into the woods. I didn't move until dawn. By morning, my nerves were raw. I packed up my camp in record time, but I wasn't ready to leave. I had planned for 5 days, and I wasn't going to let a little paranoia ruin it. Maybe I had imagined the breathing. Maybe it had just been the wind, my own breath echoing back at me. I told myself anything to keep from hiking back to my truck in defeat. I moved my camp deeper into the woods. If someone had stumbled upon me by accident, they wouldn't find me again. I spent the day hiking, putting miles between me and the print, the footsteps, the fear. By nightfall, I found a new spot, tucked against a rock outcrop, hidden from sight. I built no fire, ate a cold meal, and forced myself to sleep. The sound woke me, not footsteps this time, a whisper, low, just outside the tent. I froze, every muscle locked. The whisper wasn't words, just a sound, a quiet exhale of breath, too long, too slow. My hand found my knife. My mind raced. If I unzipped the tent, I'd give myself away. If I stayed still, I was trapped. I listened, straining to hear past my own pulse hammering in my ears. A shuffle, cloth against bark. A sigh. I couldn't take it anymore. I lunged, knife in hand, ripping open the tent. Nothing. The woods were empty, but my pack was gone. My heart pounded as I scanned the ground, the trees, the shadows. Someone had taken my pack. Food, water, gear gone. I had no choice. I had to get out. I moved fast, barely stopping to catch my breath. I ignored the weight in my chest, the fear clawing at my throat. The forest blurred around me, each tree, each shadow a threat. My boots pounded the earth. I followed my markers, praying they hadn't been disturbed. Then ahead, a figure, standing in the middle of the trail, blocking my way. Tall, still, face hidden in the morning gloom. My breath caught. I gripped my knife. My mind screamed, run. I bolted off the trail, crashing through the underbrush. Branches tore at my clothes, my skin. I didn't care. I just ran. Ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. Then the road, my truck. I fumbled for the keys, hands shaking. The engine roared to life. Tires spun in the dirt. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe until I hit pavement. I drove until I saw houses, streetlights, people. Safety. Only then did I stop, hands still gripping the wheel, heart still hammering. I never went back. I don't camp alone anymore. And sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear it. The whisper in the dark, just outside my tent. I had always loved camping. The quiet, the isolation, the way the forest swallowed the noise of the world. It was my escape, something I had done since I was a teenager. Now, at 34, I still found comfort in the wilderness. It was late autumn, and I had taken a few days off work to camp alone in a forested area of North Yorkshire. The air was crisp, the trees nearly bare, and the ground was damp from recent rain. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, away from the designated camping areas. I preferred solitude. The official sites always had families, hikers, and people who treated camping like a social event. I wanted none of that. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, with nothing but the wind and rustling leaves to keep me company. I parked my car in a small clearing just off a dirt road, far enough from any main roads that no one would stumble upon it by accident. I took my backpack, rifle, and tent, then started the long walk into the trees. The sun was setting behind me, casting long shadows through the woods. I had picked this location carefully, using satellite maps to find an isolated spot with a small stream nearby. The walk took about an hour, weaving through dense trees and patches of muddy ground. When I finally reached the spot, I set my pack down and took a deep breath. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was perfect. I pitched my tent quickly, hammering the stakes into the soft ground. My tent was small, just enough room for me and my gear. I built a fire ring from rocks and gathered some dry wood. It had been rainy, but under the thick canopy, I found enough dry branches to start a fire. The flames flickered to life as the sky darkened. I sat on a fallen log, eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread, listening to the quiet. No distant traffic, no voices, just the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of unseen animals. This was what I came for. As the night deepened, I felt the cold settle in. I threw another log on the fire and stared into the flames, letting my mind drift. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I had camped alone more times than I could count, but there was something different about this night. I couldn't place it, but a feeling crept over me, a sense that I wasn't entirely alone. I shook it off. Maybe it was just the quiet playing tricks on me. I stood, stretched, and walked a few feet from the fire to relieve myself. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently. I zipped up my jacket and turned back toward the fire, and froze. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees. I wasn't imagining it. A man. He was just beyond the reach of the firelight, a dark silhouette against the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt my stomach tighten. I wasn't near any trails. No other campers were supposed to be here. I stared at him, waiting for him to say something, to move. He didn't. I took a step toward my tent where my rifle was stored. My hands were cold, but my palms were damp with sweat. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothes. I couldn't see his face. I grabbed my rifle, keeping it close but not raising it. I didn't want to escalate anything. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was some hiker who had wandered too far. But something about the way he stood there, motionless, unsettled me. I waited, watching. He didn't move. Minutes passed. 5, maybe 10. He just stood there. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the trees. I listened as his footsteps faded. Leaves rustled, twigs snapped, and then nothing. I stood there for a long time, my rifle in hand. I told myself he was just passing through. Maybe he hadn't even noticed me. Maybe he was just standing there thinking about something else. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, keeping it burning, my rifle close. Every so often, I shone my flashlight into the trees, but I saw nothing. At dawn, the forest felt different, less oppressive. The cold air stung my face as I packed my things. I had planned to stay another night, but my gut told me to leave. I hiked back to my car, every step feeling too slow. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. When I reached my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my pulse still racing. Then, I started the engine and drove, not looking back. I didn't tell anyone about that night. What could I say? That I saw a man standing in the woods? That he just watched me? It sounded stupid, but I never camped alone again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. My wife, Emily, her mother, Karen, and I had planned a camping trip deep in the forest. Karen, a retired cop, was always up for the outdoors. She was tough, had seen everything, and nothing rattled her. Emily had grown up with that same mindset, calm under pressure, never letting fear take over. I, on the other hand, had never been much of a camper, but I went along with it. We drove out early in the morning, the back of the truck packed with supplies. The spot we picked was a few miles off the main road, tucked away from any established campsites. Karen had found the location years ago, somewhere she used to come with her old colleagues when they wanted a break from the city. It was isolated, surrounded by thick trees and miles of wilderness. No phone service, no people, just us and nature. The air smelled of pine and damp earth as we parked the truck. The sky was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that made the woods feel even quieter than usual. We hiked in, the weight of our backpacks pressing down on our shoulders. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush. A few birds chirped in the distance, but otherwise, it was silent. After about an hour, we reached a small clearing near a narrow river. The ground was soft, perfect for setting up the tent. We worked together, Emily and I setting up the tent while Karen gathered wood for the fire. Everything was routine, normal. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, the fire crackled in front of us, its orange glow casting long shadows across the clearing. We sat around it, eating the food we had packed, listening to the distant sounds of the woods. The wind picked up slightly, making the branches creak. Karen told a few stories from her time on the force, cases she had worked, people she had arrested. She had always been the type to downplay things, but I could tell some of them still lingered with her. Hours passed, and the cold started to set in. The fire had burned low, sending up small embers that floated into the darkness. We decided to call it a night. Karen, ever cautious, checked her gun before tucking it into her sleeping bag. Emily and I zipped ourselves into ours, the night air pressing in. At first, I drifted in and out of sleep, the distant sounds of the forest blending into my dreams. But something woke me, a sound sharp, unnatural, a crack like a branch snapping underfoot. I lay still, listening. Another sound. This time it was closer. It wasn't an animal. Animals were quick, light on their feet. Whatever was out there was heavier, deliberate. I turned my head slightly, my breath slow and controlled. The fire had nearly died, just faint embers glowing in the pit. The trees beyond it were pitch black. Then I saw it, the figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the fire's weak glow. It wasn't moving, just standing there. My stomach clenched, couldn't make out any details, just a dark outline, tall and still. I wanted to wake Emily, but I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched. Then, as if it knew I was awake, it stepped back, slowly, silently, gone. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, staring at the trees, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slipped into a restless sleep. The morning came with pale light filtering through the trees. Karen was already up, tending to the fire. Emily stirred beside me, stretching with a yawn. I sat up, scanning the treeline. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone. Karen noticed my expression. "You sleep all right?" she asked. I hesitated. I thought I saw something last night. That got her attention. "What?" I told her. The figure, the way it just stood there. Karen listened carefully, then nodded. "We're leaving." Emily looked at her, surprised. "It was probably nothing." Karen shook her head.
No.
"People don't just wander out here." She had a point. We were miles from any road, any trail. Nobody should have been out here. We packed quickly, faster than I'd ever seen Emily move. There was a tension in the air now, a silent urgency. As we loaded the truck, Karen scanned the tree line. She was on edge, more than I'd ever seen. We pulled out onto the dirt road, the trees closing in around us as we drove away. No one spoke for a while. Then Karen broke the silence. "I saw it too." I turned to her. She kept her eyes on the road. "When I got up this morning," she continued, "I saw footprints, big ones, leading right up to our tent. I felt cold all over." Emily swallowed hard. "Why didn't you say anything?" Karen's grip tightened on the wheel. "Because I didn't want to scare you. But we weren't alone last night." Nobody spoke after that. The trip was supposed to be a break from everything, a quiet getaway. But something had been out there with us, watching, and it had been close, too close. We never went back to that spot.